So here we are. This is the place I wanted to take you. This is the Arakawa River on the edge of Tokyo. Just take a look at this view. Whenever I start something new, whenever I've got to think about something, whenever I've got to get clarity around some problem, I like to come here, look out over the water, and just think about it. And the reason I brought you here today is because two-step speaking is going to equip you with all the tools that you need for mastering English. But I think this course is going to force you even to think about the English learning process in a very different kind of way. Not only that, but in this first module, we're really going to be talking about the psychology, the philosophy of learning a language. That is what's going on in here, the mindset stuff. And if you don't get this right, everything else that we do throughout this course is meaningless. If you don't have things sorted out in here first, you're not going to get very far. So let's take a walk down the river and let's discuss some of these mindset issues that we need to get our head around before we can get into this. On its most basic level, learning a language comes down to a very simple 2+1 step process. I'll talk about the +1 in a moment, but on the most basic level it comes down to 2 steps. Hence the name of this course, two-step speaking. Learn the language that you need, and then step 2, automate that through a process of practice, experience, actually doing the language. Where this gets difficult is you may not know what language you need, and this is where the +1 step comes in. And the +1, I guess, would be step 0, which is simply to notice or to realize, to understand, to become aware of the language that you need. To make this a little bit easier to understand, let's talk about this in terms of the 4 stages of competence. This is a very well-known theory in psychology and memory research, and a guy called Noel Birch originally came up with this in the 1970s. The stages have been modified somewhat by memory experts since, but the 4 stages of competence are, first of all, what we would call unconscious incompetence. This is where you don't know something and you don't know that you don't know it. In terms of English, this would be a conversation topic, for example, that you have never even considered that you might need. You don't know how to talk about that topic, but you've not realized that you may ever need to talk about that topic. So what we do is we notice the gap in our English, and that moves us to stage 2, which is what we would call conscious incompetence. Now we are conscious of the fact that we don't know the language for this particular topic. We know that we can't talk about this, but we still can't talk about it. So we take our second step and we move ourselves to the 3rd stage. We learn the language for that topic, and we move to stage 3, which is conscious competence. We can now talk about this topic, but we're still very much conscious of the process. We're still having to do the work in here. Maybe we're translating from our native language. We are consciously constructing the sentences that we want to use. So what we need to do now is we need to automate this language. So we take our 2nd or our 3rd step, which is to practice, to automate the language, and we move ourselves into stage 4, which is unconscious competence. This is the goal. This is where you now know the language, you can talk about the topic, and there's nothing going on consciously in here. Everything is just working automatically. This is what most people would consider fluency. What is really important to realize here is that you will never go through these 4 stages for English as a whole. Rather, you will go through these 4 stages again and again and again and again for multiple topics. And you may be at very different stages for very different kinds of topics. So, for example, an IT professional may be able to go to an IT conference and discuss his particular specialization at a stage 4 level. He's completely fluent in that topic. The words just flow. He has no problem communicating and speaking about that. That same person may then be unable to order a cup of coffee in a cafe. And he'll be at stage 1 or 2 for that. Fluency then is topic specific. There is no becoming fluent in English. And in fact, English itself is not useful at all. And I'm suggesting you should forget about English, and we're going to talk about that in detail in part 2. English is not intrinsically useful. What I mean by that is English itself is not a useful thing to have. I think this can be quite a hard idea to get your head around. But when you can really understand this, it makes the English learning process much, much easier. A really great metaphor for this is money. I've got my wallet here. Inside my wallet, I've got some money. Not as much as I would like, unfortunately, but I do have some. 100 yen coin. 10 yen. And, oh, look at that, Ichima. Big one. Got a note. What is this? Well, in one sense, we've got some money. Nice thing to have. But in another sense, we actually just have some little pieces of metal and little pieces of paper. Are those things valuable? Well, no, actually, they're not. They're just small pieces of metal, small pieces of paper. Those things have no intrinsic value. Rather, money has value because people have decided that these pieces of paper, these pieces of metal have a specific value, and that we can exchange these pieces of paper and these pieces of money, pieces of metal for things, objects, food, services. We can use this money to buy a nice lunch. We can use it to buy a pint of beer. We can use it to gain entry into a sports center, a swimming pool, whatever. Everything in the world takes money. We use these pieces of paper, we use these pieces of metal. But it's the potential then of the money that is valuable, not the actual physical things that we have. Not the paper, not the metal, but the potential that money brings that has value. English is exactly the same. English itself is not valuable. Just having words and grammar does nothing for you. What is valuable about English is the fact that you can use it as a tool for success in your life. You can use it to deliver a sales presentation that brings in tens of thousands of pounds. You can use it to persuade someone to do something. You can use it to tell someone that you love them. All of these things have value, but it's the things that we actually do that has value, not the language itself. What this basically means is that if you're concentrating and spending all of your time just focused on the language, on memorizing words, on learning grammar rules, you aren't really focusing on what you're actually going to be doing with the language. Whereas if you change your focus just slightly onto the actual things that you will do, the experiences that you want to have with language, you start to see the language in a very different kind of way. And you stop worrying about whether you've memorized enough vocabulary or whether you've internalized enough grammar rules, and you start to focus on what you can do. And that is what we're going to be looking at throughout this course. That is the angle that we're going to be taking throughout two-step speaking. The focus is always on what you do with the language, not on the language itself. So let's take a walk over to here for part number 4, because there's something I want to show you. Let's go. So on the basis then that learning a language is a case of identifying the things that you can't do, learning the language you need, and automating it via practice. On the basis that language itself is not useful, but rather the potential of language is what makes it so useful. What then is the driving force behind language acquisition? What kind of activity is learning a language? When we're taught English at school, or when we're taught languages at school, for me it was French. We are taught that language as an academic subject, in much the same way as mathematics or science or any other subject that we learn at school. It's a case of memorizing facts, random words, random grammar points, and then we're expected to perform well on tests. Unfortunately though, this is a pretty poor way to go about learning a language, because a language isn't really like an academic subject. A language is more like a sport, more like music, more like sailing a boat. It's something that you have to do and experience and feel, not just with your mind, but with your physical body. I mean, a really good example of this is sailing a boat. I have never sailed a boat before. It wouldn't matter how many books I read about sailing a boat. It wouldn't matter how well I theoretically understood the idea of sailing a boat. If I got on this boat now and took it out to sea, I would die. I would drown, because I have no idea how to pilot a boat. In theory is not enough. It's something that you have to do and experience to get good at. If you only remember one thing from this course, I want you to remember this 3-word phrase. Experience drives learning. That is, it's the things that we do in the language that promotes acquisition of the language, that makes us learn the language, that makes us get good at the language. One thing that I don't want you to misunderstand here though, is that this does not just mean speaking. It's going to seem strange that in a course called Two-Step Speaking, I'm now going to tell you to forget about speaking. in much the same way as I've already told you to forget about English. Because remember, English is not useful. It's the things that you do. It is experiences with English that drive learning. So really, speaking is simply one part of an experience that we can have. And the deepest kind of learning comes from not just speaking, not just listening, but from taking the language learning process from a holistic viewpoint. That is, you don't try to improve your speaking, you don't try to improve your reading, but you do everything and you experience the language in all kinds of ways. For example, if you take a simple phrase such as good morning, say you hear somebody say that to you, you've just heard that phrase, that's one kind of experience. You say it back, that's another kind of experience. You read that phrase in a newspaper, that's another kind of experience. There are many, many ways you can experience the same language. And the more you have these different kinds of experience, the deeper your understanding of that language will be. Obviously, the phrase good morning is a very simplistic example, but I think it kind of gives you the point. So people who try to learn English just by listening are wasting massive amounts of opportunities to get good at the language. People who are totally focused on practicing their conversation but ignore everything else, again, are not going to improve quickly or even easily because they're ignoring all of these other ways to get the language and get knowledge of the language. Incidentally, I was talking to a friend of mine recently who had some experience sailing yachts, and he was telling me that people get really good at sailing a yacht really, really quickly because of the adrenaline involved, because of the intensity of the task. And he was telling me it's really a case of you learn to do it fast or you injure yourself in a really big way. This idea of intensity and adrenaline is something that we'll come back to in this course again and again. This is one of the big mistakes that people make, and this also comes through too much focus on the language, and that is taking a far too passive approach to learning. Learning requires intensity. The brain is lazy. We don't learn what it's not forced to learn. Again, that's something we're going to talk about a lot in this course, and no need to go into it in detail now. So let's just let's sit back, take it easy for a minute, have a look at these boats, enjoy the view. We now know that learning of a language is driven by experience of and with that language. This comes with a very particular problem, and that is the problem of fear. If you're like 99% of language learners, you are afraid of making mistakes. You feel embarrassed when you make mistakes, and you try to avoid making mistakes as much as possible. This is understandable, but problematic. There are two types of people in the world when it comes to learning. People with a fixed mindset, and these, I think, are the majority of people. The other type of person is a person with a developmental mindset. If you want to learn English fast, if you want to improve and master the language quickly, I need you to be this second type, people with a developmental mindset. There's a fantastic story in the book Art and Fear by David Bales and Ted Orland. And the authors tell a story of a pottery teacher. And this pottery teacher had a class of students. And when it came to the end of the term, he decided to set a test for them. But not any old test. He decided to make this bit of an experiment. And what he did, unknowing to his students, he split his group of students into two groups. Group A and Group B. And to Group A, he said, you have to make the best possible pot that you can. I want you to make the perfect pot. Your grade is going to be based on the quality of your pot. So go away, make a perfect pot. Group A goes away and starts to make their pots. To Group B, however, he says something very different. To Group B, he says, I don't care how good your pots are. I just want you to make a lot. Your grade is going to be based purely on quantity. I'm going to take all your pots, I'm going to weigh them. The more pots you make, the heavier they are, the higher your grade. So go away, just make as many pots as you can. Group B goes away and starts to make its pots. After everybody has finished their pots, the pottery teacher collects together the final product. He lines them all up on a table, mixed. Nobody knows which pots are Group A's or Group B's. He then calls in a group of people from the outside. He doesn't tell them about the experiment, but he asks them to choose which pot they think is the most skillfully made, the most perfect pot. The group of people all pick the pot that they think is the best. Which group do you think that those pots came from? Do you think those pots came from Group A? Or do you think they came from Group B? Think about it for a second. Well, of course, they came from Group A. Because Group A, I mean, they were instructed to make the perfect pot, right? Well, actually, no. The pots didn't come from Group A at all. They came from Group B. Without fail, the best pots came from Group B. Why would this be? Group B were told that they didn't need to make a high quality pot. They were just told to make a lot of pots. Group A, on the other hand, were told to make a perfect high quality pot. Why were their pots not chosen? Well, this is the same for anything in life, especially for learning a language, and I guess especially for making pots. By telling them that they had to make a single pot and do a perfect job of it, and that is where their entire grade would come from, the pottery teacher puts a lot of pressure onto his students, a lot of pressure to perform. He put them in a position where making a mistake would be fatal. If they screwed up, if they made mistakes, they would get a terrible grade. This gave them, as I said, a terrible pressure to perform. The other group, on the other hand, had no such pressure. They were free to do whatever. Their grade is not coming from the quality of their pots. They just need to make a lot. So through the process of making pot after pot after pot after pot with no pressure to perform, what happens is naturally the pot becomes better. With each iteration of the pot, they are naturally noticing the imperfections, the flaws in their pots, even if just on a subconscious level, and with each iteration of the pot improving and making each one better and better and better. The result being that the final product is much, much better. In terms of speaking a second language, people with a fixed mindset tend to see the ideal model, the native speaker, and try to mentally put themselves into that position when they speak English. What then happens is they become frustrated because they are unable to match that perfect image that they have in their mind. The result being that they become stressed, they become embarrassed about their mistakes, and they start to fear using the language. People with a developmental mindset, on the other hand, are like the Group B people. They see each opportunity to use the language as a chance to learn from the experience of using the language. They are not thinking about the final product, what they will eventually be like. They are simply thinking about the here and the now, and about doing this, speaking or having this experience now. The result being, they don't put unnecessary pressure on themselves. They don't feel embarrassed when they make a mistake because they realize that they've just had a chance to learn something by making a mistake. The end result being that they get much, much better, much, much faster. If you want to get good at English, really good at English, I need you to be this group B, because you're going to need to make mistakes. You're going to have to screw up if you want to get good. And later in this course, I'm going to be showing you how to learn from those mistakes, because this is the important thing here. Just making mistakes is not good enough. You've got to make mistakes and learn from them. I'm going to show you how to do that and more later in this course. With that, it is time for me to go home.